they didn't go to, Luciano right away. The Navy went to the district attorney's office, told them what they needed, and they came up with, a few names that might be able to help. The first one, that really ended up being a lot of help was this mid-level gangster named Lanza. And Socks is his nickname because he socked everybody. I mean, he's like a big 275-pound man. He's got these enormous hands, and he'll punch you with brass knuckles. He was also the czar of the Fulton fish market.
Well, hey, all you wiretappers out there, it's good to be back here in the studio. We're in the middle of winter right now here in Kansas City. It might be warm by the time I get this out, at least warmer than it is right now. But this is about halfway between Christmas and New Year's. And anybody that lives back east, I know you guys have hit it. You've got it. It's been horrid back there. Really cold here, but not so much snow. Anyhow, today, I think it's a treat for me. I don't know about you guys. I hope you find it a treat, but it's a real treat for me. Ever since I was started into this mob stuff, I read my first mob book when I was probably in my teens, maybe early 20s. I can't remember. And there's this story about Lucky Luciano and World War II and some naval officers, and I maybe is in a movie or something a little bit about it, but I've never known the details on that. And it's kind of like a myth about Lucky Luciano. And, I like to get below where the myth it starts and what really gets that myth going and what really happened in World War II. Because you guys, I don't know how old you are. A lot of you are closer to my age. A lot of you are post-war baby boomers. And I was just remarking to my wife, I really long for the time when everybody was together. In World War II, and those next few years afterwards, we were like together as a country. And I don't know, we seem like we've lost that. Anyhow, my guest is sitting here, and I haven't even introduced him. It's Matthew Black. Matthew, welcome.
Thank you so much. Nice to see you.
And so the book is Operation Underworld, how the Mafia and U.S. government teamed up to win World War II. It's a great title. And I guess Operation Underworld was the name of the operation that the government started into, right?
That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, Matthew, how did you get into this?
I'll tell you a little bit about my background, and maybe it'll kind of make sense of how I arrived, at this story. I mean, I've loved history, since I was a child, and mostly got that from my father, and I've loved writing for just as long. And I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and I went to college at the University of Washington, where I studied history. I got a little sidetracked, and for about a decade, I was working at Bank of America, ended up being a bank manager, not a profession you hear for a lot of writers. And, no offense to any bankers out there, just wasn't for me and was kind of soul crushing. So,
yeah, I can imagine.
Right. But then, I left the industry for my first writing gig, and it did not go well. And in fact, it was an unmitigated disaster. I was hired to write a memoir about this man, and eventually I learned that he was running a Ponzi scheme, and I had actually invested with him too. And so he ended up getting busted by the FBI, and the notes for that book suddenly came into question if they were going to use it as evidence. But yeah, I know, right?
That's a heck of a story in itself.
I know, right? Yeah,
go back and put that book together.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, maybe one day I will tell that story. But so that didn't go too well, and kind of again doing some soul searching. But then I got an opportunity to write a book for the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. So my first book was a biography about a former president of theirs, and his name was Dave Beck. You guys probably haven't heard of him, but he was the president of the Teamsters right before Jimmy Hoffa took office, who you probably have heard of.
I have some vague memory of articles or Life magazine articles or something, Time magazine about Dave Beck
That's right.
president or of the Teamsters Union. He was a big deal in the 50s until Hoffa took over, and he was kind of a quasi criminal. He wasn't quite like Hoffa, but he bordered on being a criminal.
Correct, Gary. Yeah. No, that's great that you know that. Not a lot of folks know a lot about that. Yeah, I mean, he was president of the Teamsters from 52 to 57, so it's a ways back. And but it just it's funny because he went to jail. Yeah, exactly. He wasn't like a criminal mastermind. He kind of got caught up in some bad business. But everybody I write about either goes to prison or has been in prison. So Operation Underworld is just perfect for that.
Yeah. So now Matthew, this book about Dave Beck, for the real hardcore history true crime enthusiast, what's the name of that book? Is it available like on Amazon?
Well, it's called Dave Beck, a Teamster's Life. If you want to find me on LinkedIn or through my website, I'd be happy to mail you a copy. But what it is, the Teamsters did a history project, for their 1.2 million members, and published some books about their history, and that was one of them.
Okay, I got it. And your website, I believe, is Black Ink. Something. Remind me of the website.
Oh, yeah, no, that's a portfolio one. But for the book, operationunderworldbook.com.
Oh, okay. All right.
Try that one out.
Okay, cool. And so let's start talking about Operation Underworld, I think. Again, You have this history of wanting to do true crime. It sounds like it's exciting to you. It's exciting to me. It's exciting to a lot of people. And
sure.
And then it's part and parcel, just like the Teamsters. They're part of our psyche in the United States, and the mafia is part of our psyche in the United States. I was just listening to a podcast about why do we like the mafia so much, and it's so integrated with all of society, and in politics and business and in our entertainment in the United States, and we love the mob in this country. So how did you pick Operation Underworld? And I know you had to go in a lot of military records as well as court records and things too, I would think.
No, definitely. And I've told you kind of connection to labor and crime, but for military, that when I was a kid, my love of history, I really wanted to go to one of the academies, West Point or Annapolis, maybe even the Air Force Academy. But a couple of things dissuaded me. Number one, they have very good technical degrees there, and I'm not much, into the technical. I would have been more into the humanities, or history.
Not an engineer.
No, not really. You don't want me doing that. And then I kind of grew up in a pretty disciplined household, so the idea of people telling me what to do for the next few years didn't sound too appealing. But actually, how Lucky Luciano and Operation Underworld came to be is I've always had a fascination with him. Anybody who's interested in mafia or true crime, would find Luciano to be a particularly amazing character to study. And there's a reason that Time magazine listed him as one of the 100 most influential people of the 20th century.
Wow.
And that's because he organized crime. When you hear about organized crime, he's the one who organized it.
Oh yeah, there's the famous story, of course, how he killed off the Mustache Pete's, almost kind of replayed in The Godfather in a more popular format. But he killed off all the Mustache Pete's and organized crime with the Jewish friends. So
and in this book, I go through his background's so amazing. I tell all those stories, and you'll see a bunch are like, wait, wasn't that in The Godfather? It's like no. This was the true story, right. that led to that scene in The Godfather. So I was a few years back, I was working at an online history magazine, and it was kind of my job just to research the greatest stories in history and then try to write them up. And so I wrote a few different ones on Luciano. And then one of them that I wrote, of course, was about Operation Underworld. When the pandemic hit, the publisher that I worked for was one of the companies that went belly up. And so I lost my job, and I was on government assistance there for a little while, like so many people.
Yeah.
And again, trying to figure out what to do, how I can get this writing thing going. And then I got a message out of the blue on LinkedIn from an agent who read the Operation Underworld story that I had published, like, 4 years prior. It's finally making it to her desk, reading it. She's like, "Hey, do you want to, I represent authors. Do you want to write a book about this?" And, I've only been dreaming about an opportunity like that my entire life. So,
how many people out there who think they can write are waiting for that phone call and never got it?
Definitely. Yeah. Believe me, there's a lot of moments in my life where I was wondering if that opportunity was ever going to come. So I definitely consider myself very lucky that it did. And then when it did, you got to write the hell out of it. So, a couple of years later, here we are. It's actually, Gary, this is a special day because this is the official book release day.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'll make sure I get something out on Facebook today. I'll get some
great
out on Facebook today.
Getting a lot of messages from family and friends and stuff. It's finally arriving.
So let's go to World War II. A lot of people know the story. We don't need to rehash the story. You're telling it. I noticed in the book as I thumbed through it, you're kind of retelling that story of the night of the Sicilian Vespers, which is a myth in itself, but I'll deal with that in another show. But the night Lucky Luciano took over in a way. But now we're getting to World War II. He's in the penitentiary up in Dannemora, way north in New York, upstate New York, I believe.
That's right.
And World War II has started, and there's some problems on the docks. I believe some sabotage and some things going on at the militaries. One thing you wrote about was the a burning of a huge big ship called the Normandy.
That's right.
I don't know if that wasn't exactly the genesis of Operation Underworld, but that certainly had got the military's attention. Tell us about that ship, the Normandy. I thought that was kind of interesting.
For sure. Yeah. And that's where the book starts, where the prologue goes through that scene. And, I think it's important to start there, for one, because it kind of put the Navy in a panic, and I'll, get to that in a second. But also, it was extremely public. So the Normandy was this cruise liner that was being refitted to be a troop transport. And Normandy was the second largest ship in the world.
Wow.
It was 1,000 feet from bow to stern. And on February 9th in the morning, 1942, so, barely 2 months into the war, images of burning ships at Pearl Harbor are still fresh in people's minds. A fire starts on the ship. Within a few minutes, it kind of consumes the entire top deck. And, a ship that large, a fire that big, people are going to notice, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers, witness this behemoth just getting consumed by fire. The fire department started fighting it, and they successfully extinguished the blaze, but they hurled so much water on board that the ship ended up capsizing. So the ship was lost. At the time, there was this big fear that there were spies and saboteurs, working for the German or Italian governments that were on the waterfront, and it was suspected that this ship had indeed been sabotaged. That the enemy had got on board somehow, caused a fire, and taken it out. I mean, it was one of the most important ships in the Atlantic fleet. It could carry 15,000 troops across the ocean. It's pretty amazing. And so even prior to the event, there had been other spy rings in New York City that had been identified, and there had been ones who had been arrested and tried. They knew there were more out there, but it's all part of the Battle of the Atlantic, taking place just outside really on our home shores, in our home waters. As soon as we entered the war, the Germans sent squadrons of U-boats to our shores, and they really started wreaking havoc on our shipping, to the point where we were losing ships at about one or two a day. I mean, it was just awful amount of supplies and men being lost. We didn't have a fleet to combat them. And the big fear is that there's these spies within New York City who are communicating to the German U-boat captains about ship movements, ship routes, embarkations, where they're coming from. And if they know that knowledge, then they know where to wait. And since they were having so much success, it was just assumed that somebody in New York City, some people in New York City were communicating with the enemy.
Yeah, it wouldn't be hard to do. Just hang around the docks and you see a big ship leaving, and if you got some kind of a radio,
right, exactly. So
this ship's leaving at this time, and I watched them as they went out. Their last known location, and those U-boats were right off the coast. So,
right, and I think there was actually just a guy in a tower off of one of the coasts who just would watch the ship. He eventually got busted. But of course, like you said, it would just be just as easy to watch. And then, the actual longshoremen, the people in the waterfront who are loading the cargo, very few of them are naturalized American citizens. Most of them are immigrants, a lot of Italians, especially. And Roosevelt had even declared that they were potential enemies, which was not too smart. They're loading up the majority of our war materials. We really need them. So we definitely want them on our side. So the Navy basically identified that vulnerability. Anybody could just be watching, or if they didn't know the backgrounds of the people who were loading cargo onto the ships, perhaps they could plant a bomb. They had been to the port of New York and various places, various piers prior to the Normandy fire. But they didn't have any success, talking to anybody. Nobody would talk to them. And that was as a result of the old Padrone system, from Italy, where, you did not talk to authorities. You especially did not talk to authorities about your boss. Yeah. That could literally mean your life. So they would just, pretend like they didn't speak English. So they had no success. But once the Normandy, fire happened, they're like, okay, we have to infiltrate the harbor. We cannot guarantee that this won't happen again if we don't get our men inside. And so that's where Commander Haffenden comes in the Navy. He's the other main character in the book. And his section are filled with investigators. He's a counterintelligence commander. And his section is filled with all these private investigators, former police officers, FBI agents, and men from the district attorney's office as well. And so, the people who worked at the district attorney's office, though, knew full well who was in charge at the waterfront, on the waterfront. That was the mafia, of course, and not necessarily just Italian criminal gangs, the five families that you hear about, but there were also Irish gangs, Jewish gangs, and they controlled various piers. And they knew that the only way they were going to make inroads was if they could get the cooperation of some of these gangsters who were, big time on the waterfront there.
Interesting. So I guess somebody would have been easy to know that who was the main gangster in New York City at the time would be Lucky Luciano. I mean, he's got that cool name anyhow, but you gotta, I can see it from a law enforcement standpoint. You got to find that guy who will then give you some credibility and then speak to other people with credibility and open that up to law enforcement, as you will. I mean, it's the same problem law enforcement has investigating in any, whether it be you're a cop going into an all black neighborhood or all Hispanic or whatever, investigating something. You've got to develop sources within the neighborhood, not just criminal sources, but, corner store people and people that work there all the time to know who's who and what's what. So sounds like that's what he did. And Luciano then could introduce him to people. Is that what happened?
Yeah. And actually, the story, I mean, you're right on about that. Yeah, definitely. And it just, it kind of complicated things that Luciano was in prison, and I know Dannemora is in New York, but it's far from New York City. Yeah. I mean, it's like on the Canadian border there. They didn't go to, Luciano right away. The Navy went to the district attorney's office, told them what they needed, and they came up with, a few names that might be able to help. The first one, that really ended up being a lot of help was this mid-level gangster named Lanza. And Socks is his nickname because he socked everybody. I mean, he's like a big 275-pound man. He's got these enormous hands, and he'll punch you with brass knuckles. He was also the czar of the Fulton fish market. And that doesn't exist anymore, but it was in the lower end of Manhattan, or it's actually moved. I shouldn't say it doesn't exist. But is at the lower end of Manhattan, right on the waterfront there, and a unique situation because there's all kinds of fishing boats going in and out like every single day. It's the biggest fish market in the world. And so when when they go down there, or when they first approach the mafia, there's obviously a question of, will these men be loyal, to the United States? Will they help them out? Will they help us out? And, they were surprised to learn that even the district attorneys were like, oh, yes, these men love their country. They are patriots. They are not loyal to Benito Mussolini in Italy, who, they didn't know, but he was waging a war against the mafia. So, they had no interest in helping him. But there was also a question, one of the reasons they went to the mafia, they were wondering if the mafia was helping the enemy. And the big fear was that they were, if you go back to Prohibition days, the mafia used to run a mission. You've probably heard of rum runners, before. Yeah. So the mission they used to, carry out was that they take a fast boat to the 3-mile boundary, of international waters and rendezvous with a ship from Europe and take on, whiskey, scotch, whatever booze. And then they'd race back, into the, to the mainland with, trying to not be detected. So, the Navy knew they had run those missions before, and the fear was like, well, they could do it again, for money. They could be rendezvousing with German U-boats out at sea and giving them fresh supplies. So they had to figure out, A, are they doing that? And then B, are they willing to help us? And then C, how can they help us? And so once they get Sox Lanza involved, it's really cool because since he was at Fulton Fish Market and he has access to all these fishing boat captains, they talked to them and kind of turned the fishing fleet on the East Coast from Long Island all the way down, to New York City into kind of our first line of defense against German U-boats. These guys start looking out for U-boats. They start reporting back to the Navy if they see anything suspicious. And there's a few occasions, where there's a U-boat surfacing in an area and they're like, what is that U-boat doing there? And these are things that they have to answer. So once Lanza gets involved, they get several other ports involved. There's other areas that the mafia's influence extends to, but the problem is that Lanza, he can't get cooperation from the Irish gangs. He can't really get cooperation from the other Italian families, criminal families in New York as well, because he's just too low level to have any influence on these people. And so that's when Luciano ends up coming into the picture. And the quote there is that they needed somebody who could snap the whip on the entire underworld. And one thing about Luciano, if you know about his rise, and especially how he came to power, one of the unique things about him is that he was not exclusive in who he dealt with in terms of business. And so while his predecessors, the Mustache Pete's that you had mentioned, would only do business with Italians, Luciano's best friend was Meyer Lansky, a Jewish gangster. He was doing deals with Irish gangs as well. And his approach was more to keep the peace. Like there was plenty of money to go around. Why do we need to be killing each other all the time? And so that approach made him extremely valuable, even though he's in Dannemora prison. When they decide that they want to approach him and see if he'll help, they know that his word would go a long way everywhere in the city. So they decide to try and bring him on board. But Dannemora again was just too far. So they have to kind of go through some cloak and dagger methods, in order to get him transferred to a prison that's closer. And, even Luciano doesn't know why he's being transferred. But I bet he was happy because every gangster I ever knew here in Kansas City,
they put them in a penitentiary way down in Texas or up in the north central part of the United States. There was some that they went to. They want to be at the farm at Leavenworth, which is only about 40 miles north of Kansas City. They want to get to Leavenworth. They even tried to bribe a warden to get one of them up to Leavenworth because, then it's only like an hour's drive or a little less for family and associates and everything to meet them. But boy, when it's long ways off, it's tough. So he really wanted to get back to New York anyhow.
Yeah, I mean, he must have been like, well, his nickname is Lucky. I mean, he must have been like, what stroke of luck has happened that I'm going here, and I mean, they called Dannemora Little Siberia, because
I can imagine.
The walls would freeze in the winter, and there was actually a memoir written by a prisoner who did time with Luciano at Dannemora, and I found his memoir, and actually able to learn a lot about his daily routine in prison. Not much is known about his life in prison there.
Yeah.
And I get into the nitty gritty, like how he goes to the bathroom and, what is, the terrible activities he has to do. But once he gets to Great Meadow, just something like having decent toilet paper was just a huge, was a big deal for him. So.
Now, where did Tom Dewey figure in all this? He hated Luciano, and Luciano actually saved his life by having Dutch Schultz killed, but he hated Luciano. And now, did they just operate outside of somebody like Thomas Dewey?
Yeah, when I first started doing research for this book, I thought that I knew that there was cooperation between the Navy and the district attorney's office, and I had just assumed that would be Thomas Dewey, but I was wrong. He actually left his position as district attorney right before Operation Underworld began.
Okay.
But as your listeners will probably know, but might as well just go into it, that Thomas Dewey made his career as a prosecutor by successfully prosecuting Lucky Luciano. 62 counts of pandering, I believe it was, that got him a 30 to 50 year prison sentence. And so Luciano, I think, is only about 6 years into that sentence, when Operation Underworld begins. So he's been, in Dannemora for 6 years. He's got a long way to go. And then
that sent Dewey to the governor's office and to
run
for president in 1948. The famous picture of our Missourian Harry Truman was holding up a picture saying Dewey wins.
Dewey defeats Truman, right? Yeah. Yeah, no, and it's interesting how because obviously I read Luciano's memoir, and it's just incredible how much Luciano thought about Dewey. He just thought about him all the time. And I guess when you're in prison and Dannemora is one of those prisons that's designed to make you reflect. You're alone. Right. Yeah, exactly. 16 hours, for being alone in your cell a day, you're gonna do a lot of thinking, unfortunately. And so, when Operation Underworld gets going, within a few months, I think it was at the beginning of 1943, Dewey, ascends to the governor's office in New York, and now all of a sudden he's in a position where he could potentially pardon Luciano. And much has been made about a bribe that Luciano offered Dewey in order to get himself out of prison. And those rumors persisted for years and years and years, well after Operation Underworld. And they haunted Dewey, unfortunately. And, in the book, I talk about it. And, I certainly believe that Luciano and his faction offered a bribe to Dewey, but I don't believe for a second that he accepted it. He was a pretty straight-laced guy, and even Luciano he thinks that Dewey's playing along with him. He thinks he plays by the same set of rules. Like you said, he saved his life actually twice. Once to Dutch Schultz, and then Anastasia wanted to have a go at him.
I didn't know about
Luciano
that
stopped him. And so, Luciano feels that Dewey owes him, and Dewey's just not that kind of person. There's you don't owe people favors. You don't get you don't get rewarded for not doing something terrible, you know. Like,
And you don't become president of the United States with pardoning Lucky Luciano in your background either.
no, no,
It's not
yeah,
something
yeah.
a
So
politician wants to have in their background,
no, not
no
at
matter
all.
what
And
the reason is on the surface. It just don't go any further. So then, how did Lucky crack the whip? Did he have somebody that he sent out to talk directly to people? Because they're still not gonna. He's not gonna call them in the penitentiary and be streaming in while he says, you do take care of this, Commander Heffernan, and so he had to send word out somehow. How'd that
he
work?
did. Yeah. So one of the reasons why they moved him to Great Meadow Prison is the name. Uh, you probably haven't heard of it because it's far less notorious. It's not Sing Sing
Yeah,
or
I've never heard
or Rikers Island.
Yeah.
Probably be the one you'd want to go to if you had to go to. But anyway, one of the reason why they moved him is to make him more accessible to the people who would be able to spread the word. And who are those people? They're his top bosses, his lieutenants. So you're thinking about like a king type of the underworld getting access to all of his to his royal court, so to speak.
All his capos.
Is just unprecedented. And so, like as I mentioned earlier, his best friend is Meyer Lansky, famously known as the mob's accountant.
Yeah.
Very good with numbers and very, very well respected. And they need him, to talk to Luciano because they're not sure he's going to go along with it. And if anybody could convince him of it, it's Lansky. And I should emphasize that there were no deals given to these criminals for their cooperation in Operation Underworld. Like it's your patriotic duty. You don't get time off your prison sentences, because you're helping. And so when they finally convince Luciano to help, they bring in Sox Lanza, from Fulton Fish Market, and then some other names you've probably heard of, like Frank Costello and Willie Moretti. And Lansky, had connections with the Irish gangs. He had connection with the Longshoremen. He had connection with the other Italian families. So he could go to the leader. I was like, well, how do they keep this a secret? If they're like going to every longshoreman, on the waterfront and saying, hey, Luciano's behind this, like he wants you to help. And it wasn't like that. They went to leadership, and like Joe Ryan and Jerry Sullivan, were, the International Longshoremen Association president and chief organizer and major criminals. and you go to them and then all of a sudden you can have access to anywhere in the piers or longshoremen anywhere in the piers. So you have Navy agents, going into these situations where they're getting hired, during the shape ups and getting selected and working side by side with these longshoremen, to figure out what's what, if there's any activity going on. So.
Joe Adonis. Now, wasn't he particularly close to Luciano?
Yeah, yes, he was. And I don't have a record of him visiting Luciano in prison, which is kind of surprising because Luciano had what was called his board of directors.
Yeah.
And four names that I'm going to name here will really jump out at you. Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, of course, Joe Adonis, and then Bugsy Siegel as well, who actually does end up visiting Luciano later on because of Operation Underworld as well. But yeah, Joe Adonis, not a boss that I've heard much about prior to this story. And I was surprised that I hadn't, because he's right there, in their rise. And, he was actually part of the Brooklyn family and was a capo in the Mangiano family. And he was kind of like equal in rank to Anastasia. And one of the things that's kind of unknown about Operation Underworld is that Anastasia played no part in Operation Underworld.
Really? That's interesting.
Yeah. So prior to it, there's this murder investigation that's going on, and he was actually on the run for 2 years. Nobody had seen him since like 1939. But then lo and behold, one of the first conversations that Luciano has is about getting rid of this witness, who was a former member of Murder Inc. And so once they take him out, Anastasia comes out from hiding, and he ends up joining the army. Kind of a tactic of old to hide out in the military.
And during World War II, I mean, mob guys joined the army and fought. I know the kind of the famous, he was more of like a mob associate. Alan Dorfman up in Chicago was big time Teamster and fell with the Las Vegas skimming operation in the 70s. He got, I think he won the Silver Star. And I talked to an old mob guy here, and he said, "Oh yeah, I joined the military and served overseas." And he said, I started on troop ships coming home, and I opened a canteen and made so much money that I just stayed in and started going back and forth on troop ships, running a canteen that he and some officer that he would pay off, of course, would allow him to do this, and he'd sell things to soldiers. So movie stars, everybody, was involved in the war effort.
Yeah, and it's funny. It just goes to show, again, you think of the mafia and they're like enemies of the state. Well, perhaps they understand that they need this state to survive in order to be able to operate, within it. I don't think they would not have much success in fascist Europe.
No, they found that out under Mussolini.
Yeah, for sure. But one of the things to get back to Adonis, one of the things I go into in the book is because I was really fascinated and wanted to know what kind of business dealings the mafia was into during World War II. And of course, there's the union exploitation, which we kind of got into, and then the other big one is gambling, and it appears that Joe Adonis and Luciano were jointly invested. I can't remember which establishment it was, and they were kind of moving money around because they were getting ready. They had developed so many gambling dens and actually built them into the first versions of the casinos that we know today. Lavish entertainment. Beautiful game rooms. Over the top restaurants. All in a hotel. All places you can stay. And this kind of used to happen a lot in New Jersey and upstate New York. And Adonis was heavily connected with the Jersey crews over there. And that's actually where Willie Moretti, who was Frank Costello's underboss, that was kind of his headquarters. But anyway,
slot machines too. They were
slot.
That was Frank Costello's deal with slot machines.
Yes, certainly. So the one-armed bandits. Yeah. So in New York, that got busted up in the mid-30s by LaGuardia, and then Costello moved his operation down to Louisiana, I believe it was. So
right.
It's kind of this interesting point in the mafia's history where they're like, the prosecution of Luciano certainly rattled everybody. And you can see them getting their business holdings out of New York City, and so, Lansky and Adonis are, pushing into Florida, racetracks, casinos. And then of course they're also beginning to start to push into Havana, which, you probably know some of those efforts. And for the people who love The Godfather, that's what Godfather 2, was based on, those efforts. Yeah, Adonis is just kind of moving money, and then he's also Luciano's kind of right-hand man in the Mangiano family. So he helps deliver some informants when Operation Underworld starts gathering Sicilians, because the fight ends up going from the home front to Europe.
Sicily. And I wondered about that when they land. They're going to do some landings on Sicily as they go up the soft underbelly of Europe, as they used to call it, and go all the way up the spine of Italy. So to get intelligence and maybe even have agents on the ground over in Sicily, your Sicilians in New York going to have family over there, and they're going to know the lay of the land. So they then moved from the waterfronts to Sicily, is my understanding.
Yeah. I mean, like, as a storyteller, you couldn't hope for a better connection,
right?
Because, here you are talking about the home front, and I don't want to spoil the story, but we got the home front buttoned up.
Yeah, yeah. Well, everybody knows that.
Yeah, right. And then we took the fight to the enemy, and it's just this interesting thing that the United States and New York City in particular, had more Italians than any other place on the planet except for Italy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of those people had fled Mussolini's regime, so they were not loyal, to the government there. And when they realized that, Operation Underworld, it was realized that these guys were in a perfect position to develop these networks of informants. And so the mafia went from, of course they were still keeping, the watchdogs on the docks, and keeping everything in order. But then they started, nabbing all these longshoremen, who were known to be Sicilians. They even find like a town mayor, and they're bringing them into the map rooms, of intelligence officers, and they're drawing maps of Sicily. They're told to bring postcards with them, if they have any pictures of the coastline, just any way they can glean intelligence, of what it looks like. Because unfortunately, all the maps and charts and data that we had collected from World War I was lost. We didn't keep it. So we had nothing. We didn't even have up-to-date maps. They were getting their maps from Rand McNally. The Navy was getting their maps from Rand McNally. And so that intelligence, certainly was invaluable to war planners. It's like, officers are coming every day, into the map room and, learning more and more. And then it also becomes evident to the military planners, that if the Italian people are not necessarily loyal to Mussolini, perhaps we can get them to turn on Mussolini. But they're like, okay, if we're going to do that, we need somebody in our army who can actually contact these people, let them know that we're not trying to fight you, And so, so there are officers who are plucked right out of Operation Underworld, right out of Commander Haffenden's command. And they're given commando training in North Africa, and they develop contacts, and they land in the first waves of the Sicily invasion in Gela and Licata. I won't go into how that all ends up, but they end up making mafia contacts, from sources in New York City. They end up helping them out in Sicily, and there's a mission that they take on that has success because of that arrangement.
All right. Cool. All right, Matthew. We don't want to give away everything. We want you to buy the book, guys.
Yeah.
Believe me, I recommend you get this book. I'll have links in my show notes down below, and so I really appreciate you coming on here, Matthew. It's a heck of a book, and I'm going to get back to working on it. I glossed over it and took some notes because I just got them. Then I went ahead and interviewed you and getting this ready to go. But it's just a fascinating story. And oh, by the way, those places you talked about, I did a story on that called carpet joints. Really, throughout the United States, they did like country clubs would be just outside city limits of major cities. And they would develop the country club clubhouse into a carpet joint and have really nice dining and entertainment and a gambling room in the back. So
that's great. Yeah,
it was an interesting time in our history. It's
for sure.
And when the mafia was and the government and the criminal justice system and society, all across society, were more intertwined with each other, and it wasn't. I don't know. It was just a different time. It's not like that anymore, of course, but
certainly,
it's such a fascinating time.
Indeed, yeah, agreed.
Well, Matthew, I really appreciate you coming on here and telling my guys this story, and I know they're going to be all over this book, so I know I'm going to be.
Glad to hear it.
I appreciate it. Thanks a lot for coming on, Matthew.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Gary. Thank you.
Guys, now don't forget I ride motorcycles, so watch out for motorcycles when you're out there on the streets. And if you have a problem with PTSD, if you've been in the military or you know somebody with a PTSD problem and they've been in the military, especially, go to the VA website and get that hotline. There's help available. Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks a lot.